Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Listen, it's a real pleasure to be back here again. I always enjoy visiting the center. And today I have quite a bit of material to cover. We'll be looking at how in my team we engineer swarms across scale from the nano world to the robot world. And in particular, how we think about robustness, scalability, and adaptability, which is something that you wanted me to cover in this course. And then finally, I'd like to end with a bit of hope on how I hope we break out and break through to the real world and make some of these swarm solutions a reality. So I think for the past 20 years, we've been focusing on the science of swarming. And really our motivation has been these natural systems, the flocks of birds and their ability to create these beautiful complex dances in the sky. And what's fascinating is that these birds can scale to large numbers. So there's the scalability. If a bird falls to the ground, the whole flock doesn't crash. So they're robust to individual failure. And together they can do more than the sum of the parts. For example, avoiding predators. They're also very good at adapting. So all those features that I'd like to cover in this lecture are really core to what we see in the animal kingdom. And we might see this in flocks of birds. We might see it in ants as they make trails to your picnic table, bees as they make decisions about the next nest site, or indeed our ability to grow fully functioning human beings. And really our puzzle for us as swarm engineers is how do we go about engineering the agent to achieve the desired collective behavior that has that scalability, robustness, and adaptability. So there's really two different mechanisms to do this. Either in my team, we use bioinspiration. And so here's an example from earlier on during my PhD, actually, a while ago. And this was work in Dario Floriano's lab doing flocking with swarms of flying robots. And each one of these robots would attract to its neighbors to allow for cohesion, separate from its neighbors and do alignment, the basic Reynolds flocking algorithms. And then there was a fourth vector, which allowed them to migrate to a desired point to avoid the flock from flying away. So this is what it looked like when we throw our flying robots in the air. I was behind the camera here filming, and these are the trajectories. Over time, it converges to the stable circular topology, which we had predicted in simulation. What was interesting from a robustness, scalability, and adaptability perspective was, first of all, if you change the communication range. So if you make these communication ranges really small, you end up with mini flocks. So it's quite challenging to figure out how you make it robust to different conditions. If you change the communication, not the communication range, but how fast they can turn, you also end up with different dynamics. And so even though the rules are quite simple, and when you put them in the air, they do what we predicted in simulation, they're still quite finicky in terms of figuring out the right parameters that give rise to the desired collective behaviors. We've used bioinspiration in different areas. We've also created trails inspired from how the ants create trails, although this is simplified. Here, what you're looking at is 100 kilobots, which are these coin-sized robots that I'm sure you've come across through past lectures. And so here, what we're doing is we're releasing them from a location, and they have to find the second robot in this environment. They're just doing a random walk. When they find the agent here within a certain communication range, they stop, emit a signal. And so what you see here is the growth of a trail back to the source. This is actually a form of diffusion limited aggregation for those who are more familiar with the snowflake algorithms. But what's interesting here is that it works with random motion, so very robust to noise in the individual kilobots, which we know is quite present. And it's also quite good at adapting. So actually, if you put an obstacle on the path of this trail, it'll go around the obstacle. And if you put another agent in the environment to find, it'll find the shortest path. So those features of adaptability and robustness are things that we get for free through these very simple exchanges of information. And then here what you're looking at is collective decision-making, where 400 of our little coin-sized robots are trying to decide between blue or red. Blue is the better decision in this case. It takes about 4 minutes. Or these videos are 4 minutes long. It's quite fast for them to converge. But again, this notion of robustness is present. So here in green, you see little noisemakers. So these are little robots that are trying to inject noise in the system. And we are robust despite those troublemakers by using these very simple bio-inspired algorithms. And then finally, the other bio-inspired swarm strategy that I wanted to show you here is work that we've done with James Sharp on morphogenesis in robot swarms. So this is around 350 of those coin-sized robots. Have they seen the kilobots? So so far? So far, okay. So if you have questions, feel free to ask me more about the kilobots. But here, these robots are behaving as little cells, and the swarm is a tissue. And what each one of these little robot cells is doing is exchanging chemical information. It's virtual, because obviously they're not blasting each other with little chemicals. So they have a reaction diffusion network, a reaction network on board each cell. These chemical concentrations called morphogens diffuse through this robotic tissue. And then what emerges as part of this process are spots. And so here we're using Alan Turing's reaction diffusion systems. These spots emerge, just like you would see spots or stripes on animals. And then this drives the growth of these limb-like structures, so these little protrusions. And what's interesting is, again, it's robust. So you can see we grow these little legs where at the areas with high concentration of morphogens. And if we chop off those legs, they regrow or they reallocate cells to other parts of that robot tissue. And actually, if you split the whole swarm in two, over time, it'll bridge this gap and self-heal. And you can see these spots just dynamically reorganize depending on what's happening in terms of exchange of information throughout this tissue. So we have, through this bioinspiration, because these biological systems are robust and scalable and adaptable in many cases, the ability to use some of those rules and put them on robotic systems and get some of those features for free, at least in the laboratory. Now, one challenge that we have is very often when we're trying to engineer robot swarms, and you'll see this in the next weeks, more towards real-world applications, although I'll definitely touch on that today, we don't have the bio-inspired rules that we can use out of the box for those applications. And so we need to do increasingly automatic design. So automatic design could be a swarm engineer guessing the rules that give rise to swarming, or it could be lots of people guessing, or it could be machine learning. And increasingly, that's what we use in our laboratory. So here, what you're looking at are these little EPUC robots, and each one of these robots has a GPU on board. And using this GPU, the robots are running a genetic algorithm, which is a form, basically artificial evolution, to learn on the go how to push the Frisbee to one side of the arena. So for those who don't know genetic algorithms, the way it works is that we're trying to create a program, that puzzle that we try to solve in swarm engineering. How do you design the agent so that the collective does what you want it to do? The way we do that is that we randomly generate programs, say 100 different programs. That's generation 0. We put it on every robot and look at the swarm behavior. We give a score to that swarm behavior depending on how good it was. And this serves as a way to select the best programs. And then those programs get reproduced, mutated, just like in evolution, crossovered. So we mix good programs together, and that generates 100 new programs for generation 1. We test them, give them a score, generation 2, generation 3. And so generation after generation in simulation, we can improve those individual programs that give us swarm behaviors. In this example, it's happening on board each individual robot. So they're all running their own simulator to figure out how to push this Frisbee. And over time, actually, it takes just 15 minutes for this swarm to figure out how to collectively move the Frisbee to one side of the environment. And what's quite useful for us is that we are quite keen on understanding what the robots came up with through this automatic exploration. And so what the program of the robot looks like is this behavior tree. And this is something taken from the gaming industry to describe characters. And so we can easily read these behavior trees. We can resimulate them, we can color code them. And so, for example, we might know through this behavior tree that the best behavior was for the robots to basically turn around until they see a blue Frisbee and to change to a certain behavior. And if you have multiple of them doing that, they can kind of coordinate the pushing of a Frisbee. We can also use these automatic tools to extract behaviors from videos. So for example, in this work, we wondered, could we look at a video, either of robots, but actually now we're trying this with ants, with biological systems, and can we figure out what the agent is doing just from looking at that video? And if we could do that, that would allow us to explain the swarm behavior that's observed. It would allow us to translate it to a robot. So for example, you'd look at a biological system and then translate it to a robotic system through this process. And let's say the swarm is doing something you don't want it to do, or it's a biological swarm of locusts or whatever, it might allow you in the future to control it by having that understanding of what was happening. So again, using evolutionary algorithms, we now have the ability to, in simulation, run different behavior trees. So this is a behavior tree here, where the robots have a simple behavior across all the agents. There's different areas they can interact with. There's different boxes they can interact with. They can pick them up, they can move them. And just from looking at a video of that behavior, just one video, we're able to, using these evolutionary tools, try lots of combinations of behavior trees, look at the simulations of our behavior trees, see how similar they are to the original swarm one, which is that score that gives us the fitness. And over time, we can extract these behavior trees from just single demonstrations of robot videos. So all of that is part of our toolbox to design swarm behaviors that are robust and adaptable and scalable. And that's both from the bioinspiration and from these automatic machine learning tools. And so for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is walk you through ways in which we do this in reality, and then the need to actually be scalable and adaptable and robust for these real world applications. And then finally, think about how we break free from some of the constraints we've put on ourselves in the swarm world towards some of these real world applications. So I think the first thing when you're trying to make swarms for people is to communicate a lot about the technology. And so it's good to hear as well all the outreach that's done in the center to help people understand these complex systems. We had an escape room where we had a little bit like your escape room, but not for robots, for real people, to help people understand what swarms were. And in 30 minutes or so, they cracked a bunch of puzzles and learned about swarm robotics. And we asked them where they thought swarms should be used. A lot of them are the usual suspects: search and rescue, farming, cleaning the ocean, inspection of infrastructure. Massages, I keep pointing that one out as a surprising one, and now we have a PhD project doing swarm massages, so maybe it's good sometimes to get ideas from other people. And then we're trying to apply these. So the ways in which we've been testing these across applications, I'm going to walk you from the nano to the macro world. At the nanoscale, we've been looking at how nanoparticles that operate in the 10 to the power 13, so huge numbers, can leak out of vessels and enter into tumor tissues. And because of the sheer number of these nanoparticles, they scale. So those huge numbers is where the scalability lies. But they're also robust through their scalability, through their numbers. And what's interesting is because of their size, these vehicles are quite good at leaking out of vessels into certain types of tumors. So that makes them good vehicles for the delivery of drugs or diagnostics in those tumor environments. The particles that the labs that I've worked in, like Sabine Hauert's lab, can come in different sizes, different shapes, different cargos, different materials. Some of them are energy receptive, so you can control with magnetic fields or light. You can decorate them with molecules that can interact with receptors on the surface of cancer cells. And you can load them with drugs that you release in a more or less controlled fashion. Now, what's interesting is you can't program them like the flying robots that you saw before, but what you can do is change that size and that shape and that cargo and that material. So the 10 to the power 13, the collective, do what you want them to do in a tumor environment. And so there, because it's a medical application, you really need to think across all the parameter ranges in terms of the robustness of that treatment. So here's an example where we just changed the size and the stickiness of that particle. And so if you have a particle that's quite small, it's going to move faster through the tumor tissue when it leaks out. If you have a particle that's quite sticky, it's going to stick to the cancer cells, and then that's going to allow you to eat them up and deliver your drug. And so just those two knobs actually give you a whole range of collective behaviors. So the top one here was a particle A, which was very sticky, which sounded amazing from the perspective of being good at killing cancer cells. But when you put them in these more complex models, what happens is that sticky particle leaks out of the vessel. They all stick to the first cells they encounter, and they never go deep into the tumor tissue. So the collective behavior of that one is poor, even though the individual behavior, when you test it in a dish, is great because they're able to stick really well to cancer cells. And just those two knobs completely change the dynamics of that system. And then again, if you're looking for ranges of parameters that make sense, then you can use these artificial tools to be able to automatically explore. So we do a lot of artificial evolution, again, to design the size, the shape, the coating, the cargo, the material of the particle, so that it can optimally treat virtual tumors. And we can also grow virtual tumors depending on specifications from the patient. So these automatic tools to be able to discover the space in which your system works well is something that's quite important. At the micro scale, we're looking at bigger agents. So bacteria, protocells, mammalian cells. And in that environment, it's how do you go about controlling the agents? And one thing that we found is quite useful is light, because light gives us high spatiotemporal resolution. And so we spent some time making a playground for these microswarms. And in our case, it's called the DOME, for Dynamic Optical Microenvironment. It's all open hardware. What it is a projector with thousands of pixels of light. You can change the magnification. And then you can look at what happens to those microswarms and then change the behavior, basically. So a camera, and you can close the loop on the behavior of those swarms. That allows us to explore what would be interesting behaviors for collectives of microsystems. So here what you're looking at is building blocks of swarming. So you have here little volvox. These are some millimeter-sized algae, real ones. And we're overlaying light patterns on them to explore interesting dynamics. So in this case, we're exploring their ability to communicate. They're not physically communicating. They're communicating through this light-based system, even though they're actual algae here. And so you can see these blue halos propagate around them, and then they can transmit these messages to each other, and you can change the communication range as a way to explore the parameter ranges that might make communication in such a system more useful. You can also explore communication through the environment. So here you see the volvox laying light trails. And then it turns out volvox react to light. So you can see that one stopping in the track. So that also gives us a building block for swarming at the microscale. And at the right here, you can see it zapping these volvox, because we've learned that if you keep the light on them, they keep moving. So you need to zap them, but it's not clear at what rate you zap them. And actually we learned that every one of these volvox is different in its preference for zapping to keep them immobile. And so we also, again, use machine learning to automatically just explore the parameters that allow us to control these microswarms. So we learn preferences using Q-learning for each one of these volvox to be able to immobilize them. Over the years, we've made lots of these domes. So if you're interested in this type of control, there's domes that live in incubators, there's domes that do fluorescence, there's domes that do high-powered optical excitation. And this is our latest one, the Lumi dome, that has a high-powered UV projector that allows us now to interact better with cells and with very high resolution and to actually cause damage in those cells using UV or to excite different things that have been artificially engineered in those cells. So there you can write, you can barely see the dome. Words come out there. And in particular, as an application with Eugenia Pedini, she knows from her research that if you excite cells at the edge of a wound, so here you see a scratch wound in a dish, these are little cells, and she learned through her research that if you excite them with that light that we're using in our projector, you can help drive the leading edge of the wound through these leader cells. And so what we're doing is closing the loop to control these swarms of tissue in the wound healing process. So here what you're seeing is automatic detection of the edge, excitation of the edge, and then what you're seeing here is basically the growth over 24 hours of a side that's excited versus a side that's not excited. Again, there, the search for what makes these systems robust and adaptable is something that's quite important and actually quite challenging. We're supposed to get it for free, but it's not always easy. And then at the macro scale, we've been looking at robots that interact in social settings. So here, these are tiles. There's 100 screens on wheels, basically. We use them to help crowds brainstorm about climate change. We use them with kids to help them see that they can solve puzzles with robots by building these nice pictures. And we use them as smart post-it notes. Here you have Marahan putting messages on a post-it note, and then that post-it note automatically clusters, allowing these robots to help in the decision-making process. And then on the large drone side, we've been working with a company that makes a robot that's 10 meters in wingspan. And we're looking at how we can deploy swarms of these large aircrafts to do forest fire monitoring and mitigation. So that includes the algorithms to cover huge areas the size of the state of California. So that might be something like 30 or 40 drones. And we have different algorithms, some that are more classical lawnmower pattern algorithms, but also some that are quite similar to the flocking algorithm that you saw before, where robots using forces spread out over their environment and search a small area, or actually a large area in this case, of the environment around that. And so on the left, you see what these patterns might look like. You might think, oh, this looks really crowded. That's actually 600 kilometers, over 600 kilometers. So we're talking huge scales. And the reason we can cover these huge scales is these robots can travel 1,000 kilometers and carry 100 kilos. So a different kind of robot within these environments. We can also explore the speed at which we can detect these fires. And because we can carry water, we can potentially extinguish them further down the line. One of the key things with all of these systems is how do humans interact with the swarm? And so we've spoken to 50 firefighters around the world to understand how they would interface with the swarm, how would they monitor it, how would they control it? And we're going to come back to that in a minute, because that's going to also have to do with the scalability and robustness. One of the last applications I want to touch on, which is one that we've really been exploring in depth recently, is how can we use robots to move things around, and in particular swarms. And the reason I think swarms make sense is exactly because of their ability to be used in these messy environments. So it could be small retail, pop-up warehouses, reconfigurable manufacturing. These are environments that are not Amazon warehouses, where they've invested loads of money, they've built infrastructure, they've done R&D on the robots for that specific environment. We're talking about real-world messy places. And this is exactly where it matters to be adaptable, scalable, and robust. Let me just give you an example. Let's say I arrived down here, I don't know, and there was a cloakroom. I get doubt there's cloakroom in research centers, but let's say there's a cloakroom. And let's say I'm a robot operator and a robot swarm is operating this cloakroom. If I were to design this in the same way that Amazon designs their swarm system or their multi-robot system, I would probably map the environment, and then I would take a computer, a central node, and this central node would control all the other robots in that environment. So if I arrive with my jacket, I would arrive to that central node and I would say, pick up my jacket. And that central node would say, robot 1, 2, 3, follow this trajectory, pick up my jacket, 1, 2, 3, follow this trajectory, and store it in a specific location. At the end of the day, you would do the same process so that that jacket would be looked up in a database. The central computer would direct the robot to go pick it up and bring it back to you. Now, in that context, it required a map of the environment. It required communication, centralized. It required the database of where your jacket is to always be up to date. And it required that central node to work. And so there's a risk that that system is not robust if that central node is no longer operational. If you were to install this cloakroom out of the box using swarm approaches, you would probably put a line on the floor, and then you would take robots out of the box, how many you need, 2, 3, 4, because of this scalable potential. And then because the robots don't need a map, they just start moving around within that boundary. You would arrive with your Bluetooth app and say, I have a jacket. And then a nearby robot would come, pick up your jacket, and deposit it anywhere in that cloakroom. You would arrive at the end of the day with your Bluetooth app somewhere along the edge of the cloakroom and say, where's my jacket? All the robots look around. One of them sees it, picks up your jacket, and brings it to you. In that context, we don't even need to know how many robots are in the system. There's no map of the system. We don't need global communication, and we don't need a database of where everything is. So actually, if you wanted to go and pick up your jacket, you would be able to do that because it doesn't actually matter that people are messing with the environment. And so that's exactly the type of real world environment where being out of the box, I think, is well suited for swarms because of that adaptability and robustness. Now, this type of application does also require new kinds of robots. And that's because to be usable outside of the box, these robots need to better understand the world around them. So for example, this is a DOTS that we've built over the past 4 years. And these DOTS for distributed organization and transport system have a 16 laser time of flight range sensor, 4 cameras. They've got a GPU, 6 CPUs on board, batteries that last 6 hours. They're actually quite fast because they're driven by motors, drone motors, and they also have a lifting platform. So now all of a sudden, robustness somehow comes from the ability to understand the world around you in a way that you can interact. This is an example of them operating in the lab. So we've built a custom arena for them. And here what you're looking at is a random behavior, but that does the job. So they're picking up the boxes here, bringing it to this side of the environment. It works quite fast, around 2 minutes. And it really, again, it operates using simple random walk. Find a box, you lift it, move around until you reach this area and deposit it. So on one hand, this works out of the box. On the other hand, you think, will people be okay with this kind of behavior in their cloakroom? Or are they going to just look at this and be like, what is going on with my swarm? And increasingly, what we're able to do is give more information to the swarm through distributed spatial awareness. So it's still fully distributed, but we can make the robots make sense of the world around them. The way this works is using Gaussian belief propagation. Simon Jones has a really nice paper about this that just came out. And essentially all the robots, through Gaussian belief propagation, which comes as well from Andy Davison's team, all try to predict where the center of the world is. And so at the beginning, they all think that they're the center of the world. And then over time, they exchange very little information, actually, but very fast, in around 60 seconds or so, they're able to converge towards a common understanding of where the center of the world is. And so if you have a common understanding of where the center of the world is, all of a sudden, you can be a bit smarter about the types of behaviors the swarm can do. So for example, on the left, these robots, through little exchanges of information, are predicting where boxes are in the environment. So they no longer need to randomly search. They could go to those boxes. Actually, they can be quite smart. They can also try to move to areas where there's not enough information to better do updates. So at some point, you're going to see these boxes move. You can see the update happens, but is a bit slow. But you could also ask the robots to seek better information collectively. So at some point, you should see them all have an interesting behavior. On the right, what you're seeing is shape formation. So the robots, because they have a common understanding of where the center of the world is, so there's the information seeking behavior, where now by moving to areas where there's less information, they can quickly update the box information. And here they can create these shapes and patterns in the environment because they have a common understanding of the world. So now, one of the questions is, okay, if we can make these robots in real world applications, how do we make them trustworthy? And it's early days, I would say, in figuring out how to do that. One is to think about all the properties that need to be checked. So is it an ethical application? Does it comply to legal requirements? How do we take into account accountability, the user interactions? How do we take into account physical properties like harm or behaviors that are not desired from individuals and swarms? And how do we think more systematically about the ethics of these deployments? And this is something Ellen covered, so I won't go into detail, but we have a nice paper coming out with Alan Winfield looking at swarms in nanomedicine, swarms in environment monitoring, swarms for fire monitoring and mitigation, and swarms for logistics, and really walking through different dimensions of ethics that we need to take into account. On the nano side, we're talking to clinicians, to patients, to researchers, to think about how nanoswarm technology could be deployed in the body. And if you're interested in that, Matimba Swana has been doing really interesting research on would people be willing to participate in a first human clinical trial of nanoswarms. And more broadly, we've been thinking, what does it take to make these systems trustworthy? So for example, the swarm properties that we're talking about today, the proficiency, the robustness, the scalability, the adaptability, I'm going to go over these in detail now, but do they actually help in making a system trustworthy? And we'll discuss that. Human swarm interactions, how can people understand, monitor, and control these swarms? Testing, how can we specify, verify, and validate these swarms? How can we detect faults? How can we recover from faults? Because even though I keep saying they're robust, they're scalable and adaptable, they actually are not if you're not in the right parameter ranges, and there's critical failures that really mess with your system. On the swarm properties front, it's worth really thinking about, do these features of swarms help? And I think we won't know if they help, and we can't design for them if we don't have metrics. So these properties have been described in many papers, mostly in a verbal way, or they've been used in papers where like it's scalable and by showing that you can increase the number of robots, but it's quite challenging to find a systematic metric. And so this is a first attempt that we've made, but very happy to adapt it and discuss it. This is something that we're working on so that we can better quantify robustness, scalability, and adaptability. So one thing that we've been looking at is robustness, so the ability to cope with agent failure. So basically, robots fail. Is the system still robust? Scalability, the ability to cope with the changing swarm size. And adaptability, the ability to cope with changing external parameters. And we're going to explore this in the logistics scenario. So what we have here is an environment, 5 meters by 5 meters, which is our arena in the lab. And we're trying to bring boxes to this deposit area in the arena. We have these little robots here, and we have boxes in the environment. And then at the top, we just have, this is just to say there's an algorithm that helps the robots know where the exit is. So it's an algorithm that allows them to figure out how to go towards the deposit area. And so the things that we've been exploring is our system scalable? So here, scalability in our current metrics is defined as the percentage change in performance when moving from n to n plus m robots. So for example, moving from 10 to 20 robots over the percent change in swarm size. And the general idea is that if your performance increases much more than your number of robots, then you've got a system, or just increases more than the number of robots, you've got a scalable system. And if it increases much more, then it's a superlinear system. So this allows us to show ranges in which we have different scalabilities for our system. We've been looking at fault tolerance. For example, in that swarm moving boxes, we can inject faults in simulation. One failure mode 3 here, for example, is a failure where depending on the number of agents failed, it actually doesn't impact the performance very much. But if you have this failure mode 4, you can see that the failure is critical. So the more failed agents there are on the system, the lower the performance. And you can also see what the performance would look like if you had just removed those agents instead of them being faulty. And so what you can do then is have this metric for fault tolerance that basically compares your performance delta if you have a certain type of fault versus your performance delta if you just removed robots. And the idea is if it's positive, that means you're fault tolerant. And if it's negative, those are worse than just removing the agents. On robustness, so it's quite similar, but here we're looking at the performance under M faults out of N agents based on a performance 0, which is a performance without faults, but it gives you a similar readout. And then overall, we have this is just a summary of the things that I've shown you that basically allow you to think about, I missed the adaptability one. So the adaptability figure disappeared, but adaptability is very similar, and that we're looking at the change in performance or depending on a change in parameters. So for example, if you change the size of the arena, how resilient are you to that size and the change of the arena over different ranges? And so again, you have this simple metric, which is A bigger than 0, which shows you that your system is adaptable or not. So these metrics could be helpful in the future to explore, first of all, how to optimize your system for robustness or scalability or adaptability. or sometimes just choose the ranges in which you want to operate because you have a better understanding of how it impacts the performance of your system. But does that help humans? So for example, and we don't know, for example, robustness. You could think that being very good at resisting to failure is great. Your system continues to operate even in the face of failure. So that might make your system more trustworthy. But if you have lots of agents failing, is that going to make the system less trustworthy because they see all these robots doing things that are a little wonky? Scalability. In theory, it's great if your system continues to operate in huge numbers. But do people trust systems that work in large numbers? We don't know. Adaptability. In theory, that's great because your system continues to work, even when you have very different parameters to your scenario. So that could be more trustworthy because it continues to work. Or it could be less trustworthy because it's always changing its behavior depending on the type of environment it's in. So these are things where now, once we have a metric, we can start to think a little bit more what human experiments we can do to try to understand what mattered in the trust interface with humans. We can also use these as metrics. So for example, if we want to make swarms that are easier to understand and monitor and control, and in particular control, it would be helpful if people tell us what they care about when designing a trustworthy system. So they might care about safety, for example, in the cloakroom. They might, maybe humans walk in that cloakroom. So maybe they want a very safe system, or maybe they want a very fast system, or maybe they want a very robust system so that it's not too finicky, or maybe they want better energy use. So these are all parameters that if humans can select what they care about, and in particular, if we have numbers to give to these things, we can use algorithms like map elites that allow us to create, to tension those different characteristics so that you can understand, okay, if I want a certain amount of robustness and safety, this is the behavior for you, and you can navigate that. And as a human operator, choose the right control. You can also think about how these robots move in the future. So this is a start at human trials. What we're doing here is exploring the cloakroom. So people came and used our robot cloakroom. They could choose what to deposit in it. And then they were exposed to two different conditions. One was organic and one was structured. Organic just means they don't move perfectly. They zigzag a little bit. They look a little messy. Structured was very angular, very structured, the way you'd imagine a robot system to work. And so we brought people to the lab, we exposed them to these different types of organic motion or structured motion. And it turns out they don't seem to care as long as it works as well in terms of the performance. So it's really hard to figure out what makes a system useful in these real world settings. In terms of how we think about demonstrating that the system will be robust, there's also a whole field of specification, verification, and validation. So how can you specify the behavior of a swarm? You have to specify what you desire from the emergent properties. And so we've adapted work with Kirsten Eder's team from the machine learning community that has a similar challenge. They need to specify what's learned, and that's also quite emergent. And we've used that to specify emergent properties. And so, for example, in the cloakroom scenario, we have all these different things that we want to make sure the swarm as a collective does. And we also have some that could cause critical failures. So for example, in our cloakroom in the UK, they're very paranoid about fire. So let's say this red square is a fire exit, and they really don't want to block any fire exit in any way in any building in the UK. And so we thought, well, an emergent property of the swarm might be you block the fire exit. And so we have a specification that says the swarm never needs, the robots, or the swarm actually never needs to be blocking that fire exit. And so what we do as well is once you have the specifications, you can do macroscopic formal models, you can do low fidelity simulations, you can do high fidelity simulations, you can run things on the real robots, and you sort of get this feedback loop. And so we did across all these different levels, our verification and validation process. And this is the one in real robots. And so you can see they keep dropping into that red area, which is bad, which goes against the specifications that we'd set. And so that gives you information about how you need to update your system. The other thing you can do is fix the system when it goes bad. So even though we say systems are robust, they are not always. There can be critical failures. And so in this work, we've been looking at robots that can detect using local measurements that they're faulty and fix their behavior. Here, what you're seeing is a behavior where 4 robots need to work together to carry a box. And so in this case, these red robots have a failure that causes the swarm as a whole to not do their task. They're not able to move the box if they have one faulty robot under that box. So that's a case where you have a critical failure. Your system, even though you've designed it with distributed rules, all of that is simply not robust to those types of failures. They can't lift the box. And so thinking about ways in which robots using just local metrics can figure out that they're faulty and remove themselves from that situation will also be critical to the robustness of the system. So for example, here we have our faulty robots in red. They've self-detected that they're faulty. And now they move themselves to the left of the arena because we can't just make them disappear, unfortunately. And so that allows them, even though it's a bit slower, to finally move these boxes to the deposit area. So it's a bit slower, but it allows us to save the system. It's what's interesting as well through these data-centric approaches is we can test loads of different faults. We can test loads of different mitigations. So you think very systematically about what can go wrong, what can you do about that thing going wrong in your swarm. And because they're swarms, it's not obvious. So for example, when it's negative here, these are faults where actually if you mitigate against them in almost any way, the swarm performs worse as a collective because they're not critical failures. So that agent in the swarm, even though it's not a great agent, is still contributing to the system. For example, if you're going only 50% speed, mitigating against that agent is actually not good for the swarm because it's slow, but it's still helping. Whereas there's some of these that are profoundly critical and you need to move those swarms out of the way. So I think it's not always clear how you go about making a robust system in the face of these faults. So for this last part, I think we're building the tools to be able to translate these robots to the real world. But I think it's also made us open our eyes to maybe ways in which we can be a little less religious about the swarm literature. And I think it's been a beautiful journey over the past 20 years, looking at how we design these swarm systems. And Errol Sain has this beautiful, beautiful paper on swarm robotics from sources of inspiration to domains of applications. And it says swarm robotics is the study of how large numbers of relatively simple physically embodied agents can be designed such that a desired collective behavior emerges from the local interactions amongst agents and between the agent and the environment. And that has been driving us all these years. And the focus is autonomous robots, large numbers of robots, few homogeneous groups of robots, and relatively incapable and inefficient robots. And this has led to amazing research in science over the years. And I've loved seeing this, and a lot of the research that we do does this as well. But when I was at ICRA 40, which was a big gathering of all the roboticists celebrating the 40 years of robotics, someone quite prominent went on the stage in front of 1,000 people and said, swarms can't be used for real world applications. Oh, Tom, were you there?
Who was that?
I'll tell you offline.
Okay.
But as a community, we've been like, wait a minute, Marco Dorigo has this beautiful paper about where the field is going in terms of real world applications, right? Civil applications, ocean monitoring, entertainment, robots in everyday life, on the moon, millimeter microscale, collecting microplastics in the body. All these things are, it's a long timeline, but not a crazy timeline, and things that we believe in. And the reason we believe in it is because it makes sense that a lot of applications of tomorrow, whether it's, building kilometer scaled solar stations, logistics at a city scale, agriculture, construction, monitoring huge areas for fires, even in the body is a huge scale, require many robots to work together. These are things you simply can't do with a single robot. On top of that, they're the messy places that we can't just assume we'll be able to put infrastructure or program a perfect solution. And so we need to embrace this, robustness, scalability, adaptability, all the stuff that swarms are good for. And I think this, this potential, but not quite yet there, has been seen before in what we've seen in the AI community, where the idea was there, but then it took a winter, and then all of a sudden enablers, so computation, better algorithms, better hardware, for there to be a breakthrough. And so I think in the swarm world, we're actually at a point where we need to think about the enablers. And so we had this really fun workshop at ICRA in Japan this year, called Breaking Swarm Stereotypes, with amazing co-organizers. And so we took some of those principles that were defined a while ago, and thought maybe we can make them a little bit more flexible. So for example, incapable or inefficient individuals, actually increasingly we can make our individuals very capable, just like ants and birds are very capable. Why can't our individual robots be quite sophisticated in their ability to perceive the world? Only local sensing, but maybe we have a bit of help from the cloud. So maybe there's a little bit of information that lives elsewhere than in that local environment. Large numbers, but perhaps those swarms are sparse. Autonomous, but we're going to need some level of human control, so they may not be fully autonomous. Homogeneous, or actually heterogeneous. And actually the work you showed me before is they're heterogeneous anyway, because there's noise in each one of those individuals. And then emergence, but actually trusted emergence. So in a way where people feel they can adopt this. And we're starting to have a lot of the building blocks. I don't know if this is going to be the future at all, but it's worth saying that these robots might have better perception, better cognition, thanks to some of the developments in the AI community. These are tools from Roscon just this year, looking at AI-powered robot arms and whatnot, but that are prompt generated, and we're using it for image processing right now. Better robots with more computation. This is work that we're doing now where the robots work based on distributed principles, but there's also information that lives in the cloud. For example, here, they need to deliver blue to blue, green to green, yellow to yellow, pink to pink, and they can do that in a distributed way. But if they say, I've picked up green, and send that to the cloud, it's a tiny bit of information that means that no one else picks up green in the environment. And so what is the right balance between centralization and decentralization of information? And ideally, if you remove that cloud, the system still operates. We can now build at huge scales robotic systems. This is from very recently a 10,000 drone display show. And this is at Glastonbury Pixmod. They have these bracelets that synchronize at the scale of huge, I don't know how many there is in a stadium, but huge numbers. When I showed you this drone, you see this and you're like, wow, that's really crowded. But this is over 600 kilometers. So if you were to look in the sky, you probably only see one of these robots. So they're very sparse, even though they are interacting and coordinating. And there's really nice review papers also looking at how sparse swarms maybe make this more credible, so you're not stepping on all the robots in the way. On the drone side, these are more recent trials this summer. And actually, we were just trying something else. I hope to have news on that soon. And there again, how do the humans, this is actually the company looking at the interface that we've designed, clicking a button that says swarm to be able to control these systems. How can we design automatically better control? This is like nice work by Mauro Berrettari and colleagues looking at how we can define missions and then with a click of a button, automatically find the right control for those swarms that adapts to different missions. And then increasingly, we're going to have a messy world with lots of different types of robots. And so this is a project called Emerge, which we work on in emergent awareness from minimal collectives. And it really pushes this idea that individuals, by being aware of their behavior and aware of the behavior of the collective, can better interface with humans, but also with each other, so that we create these messy societies of robots. Better trust, which I think we can demonstrate instead of assuming because it's emergent, it's just not going to work in the real world. And then I think increasingly, we also need to think about socio-digital futures. So this is work with a Center on Socio-Digital Futures in Bristol, thinking about what robots look like in local communities. What's the interplay? What do people want? Because there's lots of ways you could design a logistics robot. You can make little squirrels carrying boxes that go hide in trees. You can make, like some people think, humanoids that just walk around the campus and bring you your box. You can make, which is probably closer to what we're designing now, robots that carry packages, or maybe you have your little pet that goes get a package. All of that is going to change the nature of how these robots are deployed, how they're perceived by those local communities, and whether they're useful or indeed accepted. So we've been exploring how will we know which ones will work? I think we need to create them. So I think we're at this junction where it's time to make swarms. We have a pretend startup, which we're just starting to think about, called Swoot, the swarm that goes woot. So we figured out the name. We don't quite yet have the whole spiel, so watch this space. But this is part of an incubator that we recently did. And 5 of the 30 startups were about swarms. So people are starting to think about it. So what I hope to get out of the students, especially in the room, is that I think swarms make sense because they have the potential to be usable out of the box because of their adaptability, robustness, scalability. And so the hope is that you help break some of these swarm stereotypes and keep doing amazing science, because that is the foundation of everything we do. And hopefully work together, because what's interesting is these stereotypes, if you do live a bit in between, you can work with multi-robot community, you can work across different research fields, which is quite helpful. This work is powered by humans, it's not just robots. So this is our Christmas dinner from last week. And overall, very cross-disciplinary with the help of many colleagues in Bristol and also in previous places that I've been. So thank you very much.